Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. And as part of that, we're looking at what the future of medicine, future of health, and future of pharma looks like as we continue. Our guest today is a very well-known, globally known futurist, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, consider cannabis or ponder pharmacy. This is the podcast for you. I'm a lawyer. I do have to say this. It's not legal advice, not clinical advice. Our guest is a physician, definitely not clinical advice either. So the other piece is, again, I do these podcasts because they're a lot of fun. I do these live streams because they're a lot of fun. I find myself learning something new each time. So if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe. And if you find someone who might enjoy this talk, because I know I will, please share because they might like hearing about this. You can find me on Twitter, Darshan Talks, or go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our guest today is someone I have interviewed a few times before, and each time I'm amazed by the knowledge he brings to the table. He is a physician, but he is globally known as being a medical futurist. And he's currently in the middle of writing a book, and I want to ask him a little bit more about that. And he's doing research, and the way he's doing research is the type of ways I want to do research as well, which is traveling all over the world, meeting new interesting people, and changing the world as he does it. So our guest for today, Dr. Emmanuel Fombu. Manny, how are you?
I'm doing great, Darshan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. First question, Manny. When you talk about futurism, what does that mean to you, and why is that something we need to consider?
For me, when I talk about futurism, especially around healthcare, I'm not talking about what happened 2,000 years from now or 20 years from now, right? I think especially in healthcare, there are lots of technologies that are available today that could transform the way we interact with the healthcare system that we're not taking advantage of. And you are a lawyer, and I would say because in that process of innovation, we have different stakeholders outside of a traditional clinical role, right? We have a compliance, regulatory, we have legal people that are all in, and not everyone is up to date with what's happened with the technologies. It's been a challenge that I've faced in the industry and even in clinical practice. And so I think being out there to educate the community about what technologies are available, what the regulatory barriers are, and how we can overcome them is the best way to go to make sure we have improved healthcare outcomes.
So do you think that as a futurist, your goal is to inform or to shape the future?
Inform and shape for a couple of ways. So one is, if you look at something like telemedicine, right? Like pre-COVID, when I had conversations pre-COVID and I said telemedicine, people would say, oh, something in the past, we tried it, it did not work, so we're done. That's what people say, right? Then COVID came, and then all of a sudden, you're seeing companies like Teladoc, right? These companies, they're going public, they were billion-dollar valuations, and everyone is excited about it. But at the end of the day, that's not innovation, actually, on my side, right? Because if you look at, everyone has a WhatsApp on your app phone, right? You have FaceTime. You came with someone through video. The regulatory barriers and legal barriers around health information is what makes Teladoc's extra special in that sense, right? It's not an open line of communication. But there are many countries in which people don't have Teladoc, right? Where FaceTime works and WhatsApp works. It's the same kind of concept. And I think shaping that is one piece of it. But now what happens is, how do you shape that world where you have telemedicine? The biggest challenge there, obstacle, is that it's difficult to measure vital signs or other symptoms at home, right? So how do we make that better? How do we improve that? We have tons of startups now and greater solutions that come in to measure remote blood pressure monitoring, right? Remote, dermatology visits and different things we can measure at the home. And so that's how we shape it, by bringing in those innovations and make people actually imagine what the future looks like. If we could incorporate these solutions and then have that perfect kind of solution going forward. So it's to inform and then shape.
So it's interesting you say that, but let me because one of the things that always stuck to me is, are you a Star Trek guy?
Oh yeah, I am.
Okay. So one of the things that really came out to me was we now routinely try to mimic what we see in sci-fi, and we Tesla, I think, Elon Musk, I think, had the X Prize, or someone else had the X Prize And the goal was, how do you make sure that we can now mimic what we saw on TV 30, 40 years ago with the tricorder? And they were trying to do that. And I think we had a successful entry as well. First of all, I see you smiling. Do you know much about that one? Or
Yes, I actually spent time. There's a conference that takes place in Scotts Valley, California, annually for futurists. It's called the Augmented Intelligence Conference.
Oh, okay.
I do attend that conference, and it's you have the first time I went, there's about 30 people, like just select people, high school kid. There's a retired pilot. There's a filmmaker, a couple of celebrity actors. You have a couple of Nobel Prize winners, like a mix of people. And what we do is we sit together for 3 days and we imagine what the world looks like in 2030. From this, how the cities look like and what does healthcare look like. And you can fit yourself in any group and boundaries on what you can imagine. So there's no regulations. But the principle, one of the exercises is you need to have universal basic income as a rule.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we imagine the world and we spend 3 days hashing things out. Mike Stegmark, someone I really admire from MIT, that wrote a book, Life 3.0, happens to be at this conference, and I love spending time with him. Right? He's an advisor to Elon Musk as well, right? On regulations, but it's a brilliant conference. You have nuclear physicists around, and it's like 30 intimate chats over marshmallows, right? And 3 days together, it's fantastic, and that's exactly what we do. And I think in healthcare, Darshan, because you asked that piece, if we use the same kind of framework, which is what is used in Hollywood to actually design these Star Trek movies, right? Where let's imagine the possibilities of healthcare without all these regulations around, and then backtrack and say, how do we make it happen? I think that's the best way to do it.
I think that's awesome, but here's my question that comes out of that. When you see Star Trek, it talks about this unified world where we all have the same opportunities. And you talked about universal basic income a little bit here. So I'm going to layer that into the conversation. But I guess my question is it fair to see what 2030 looks like, but not consider where it happens? And what I mean by that is 2030 in New York is going to be very different from 2030 in rural India. So how do you visualize 2030? Where do you visualize 2030?
That's a great point. I always say that the future is here now, but not for everyone, right? So some of us are living in the future today,
right,
right, in distant future. And it's quite evident, like I mentioned, like I just came back from a tour of like traveling through Europe, look at different countries, how they deal with COVID, and you realize that things are completely different, right? Where in the US, we have access to vaccines. I've been in Europe where people are waiting months to even get access to vaccines, right? So the future for us is here now. Look at Japan and the Olympics happening right now where like 22% of the population actually is vaccinated, right? So the future is not there for everyone. And so that's a unique piece of it. And it comes down to this personalized experience, Darshan. We said personalized medicine and personalized experience. If you look at healthcare in the Western world, the US is advanced in certain units. But if you look at the NHS, for example, in the UK, because they have a more complete database, they're completely different compared to Israel. They also have very universal kind of database, centralized. Compared to us in the US, we have different kind of pieces. So clearly, people are more advanced, but the journey stays the same. If you look at healthcare in India compared to Cameroon, where my family's from, India is definitely way advanced than where Cameroon is. So what is the best example? Would be an example of India. But also Rwanda, for example, Tata, for example, from India, is big in Rwanda and is leading healthcare down there, right? It's not Google in Africa doing it, right? Google's open office, but Tata. So I think for every part of the world, whether you're a developing country or you're a developed country, there is a leader in that environment, and you follow that path because the infrastructure fits your needs much better. We can't have this one size fits all kind of technologies, just so we can have one size fits all kind of medicine.
It's a great point. You can't have one size fits all medicine because it has to be personalized to where you are. So does that create a dichotomy, a break of what 2030 looks like? And the result of that is therefore, should innovation be aimed at the lowest common denominator, or should it be aimed at the highest common denominator?
I think innovation should be aimed at access. And I'll tell you the reason why. If you look at Facebook today or Google, you could be anywhere in the world and you have access to Google or Facebook, right? What prevents someone in the rural part of India or Africa to connect with a clinician in the United States if they are willing to pay the price? We assume that they can pay, so we create these different silos for things and put in different buckets. If you look at what happened in India recently, when you look at COVID and the death rates then in COVID, where oxygen became like a commodity down in India, right? People in rural areas were dying, but they had clinicians that were experts in California and New York that are dealing with these patients. Why can't they have direct access to them through technology? Is there a barrier for them to use Facebook and connect with someone like through a messenger piece and talk to a clinician? And the different models of how you can do that. I think we need to break silos and scale, realize we're humans and their expertise around the world. And we create those kind of connections that is not driven by insurance companies or driven by these things, because people are willing to pay for something or doctors are willing to do for free, right? So let's like create these boundaries and prevent people from talking to each other. I think eventually if we open up access and people connect to the best based on their ability to pay and whatever people want for free or pay, I think that's the best way of doing it.
So it raises this interesting question. You asked this, so let's explore that a little bit. You said, let's break down those boundaries. Let's allow people to access the care, which I think is great. As a concept, it sounds awesome to me. But the implication of that is things like who provides that access. And what I mean by that is, let's say it's Google or Facebook or someone else, one of the big tech companies providing it, not a Teladoc is the point I'm making, but whether it's Teladoc or not, it doesn't matter. Who owns the data of what was transmitted? And does it matter how that information gets accessed? So is it okay to create provide access to these patients in exchange for holding their data and they don't know any better? Or is that exploitative?
That's a big challenge piece around data ownership piece, right? If you look at, there's a quote about if you're not paying for it, then you are the product.
Yeah.
right. And we know that there are lots of interest in patient data around the world. For example, we know today that in clinical studies conducted, Darshan, that minorities, African Americans, or Africans, or Indians, or women, pick a place like Sri Lanka. How many people from Sri Lanka represent in a typical clinical study, right? That's just a typical place. How many Nigerians, how many Cameroonians, how many South Africans? And I think, and industry needs access to these data sets to actually make more decisions to open up access. Is it not better in exchange for that? Is it not worth the price to say we'll cover an expense for the $150 televisit with someone from Nigeria in exchange for your data sets? That's a fair thing to consider, right? And so is it a monetary issue or what? So I think those kind of frameworks, I think those are things that we need to discuss as a community, but this will not be driven by governments. If we wait for the FDA and everyone else to come up with these rules, it will never happen, right? If you look at Facebook trying to create like internet in Africa, they don't go through the telecommunication agencies to figure out what to do, right? Only in our industry do we wait for the federal government to give us guidelines on what we should do. I think we should create a path, come up with a great framework that we all agree on, and then propose that path and then move forward with it.
I think that sounds great in concept, because I think your point is that we are more innovative than what the agencies can do, because the agencies react as opposed to are being proactive, if you will. And that's fair. But my question is, in many ways, we've sort of done that though right now, haven't we? Where we've basically said, we'll let industry do what they want. And what industry did was create personalized versions of each one of us that we barely have access to, decide what they're going to sell to us, and then weaponize that knowledge. And now we're trying to catch up with things like these different privacy laws and the different biometric laws. I mean, there's a great example of let industry do what it will, and then we'll catch up. And that's Henrietta Lacks, where we basically said, I know I'm sort of doing a soliloquy, so I'll give it to you in a second, but where we basically said, we'll take all the data and we'll use it, and then let FDA and stuff come back and make rules later on. Sorry, Manny. Your turn.
No, you're right, Darshan. When you say industry, as a better point, when you say industry, are you talking about the healthcare industry or the sick care industry? I have to fight it, right? I think, and the reason why I say that is this. The problem we have is that healthcare today is driven by what I call the sick care industry. If you look at anyone that's interested in digital health, right? If you hear Google did something or Amazon did something, we have all the cheerleaders clapping behind them, right?
Yeah.
If we hear this company raised $100 million or $200 million, everyone goes clapping behind them. Tons of companies behind them that still have great innovative solutions. They have not raised $100 million, $50 million, but have a great solution, but no one hears about them, right? So, and most of these things are driven by disease-driven medicine. So you're sick, disease, and the solution behind it. But if you look at the tech companies like the Amazons, if you look at Facebook, or you look at Google and Fitbits coming into the space, they are coming from a healthcare perspective. Okay, healthcare does not mean that you are healthy and you're not sick, but you have to look at someone as a holistic piece. If you are sick, what is the best version of you living your life with your disease? If you are healthy, what is the best version of you preventing disease? And that's more of a consumer-driven kind of market that we are going into, and I think that will transform healthcare as we watch. If you look at every pharma company today, the payers will look up to the tech companies because they bypass these rules that we are talking about sick care. Because when you do sick care, no one trusts you in sick care because you have an agenda behind it, right? And it doesn't matter how much evidence. Look at the COVID vaccine; it's a great example. There is amazing evidence that the drug works. People are still having debates about the vaccine. Still, regardless of the evidence, right? It's still a challenge to get people to get vaccinated. And so it's much better for us to say, if you're in the business of healthcare, then you have solutions that are beyond an agenda of me selling you a drug. It's a universal kind of solution. That's the way I think pharma companies need to think in the future. The idea of beyond the pills kind of solution will be something that should be established, and every drug coming to the market should have a solution around it that captures data sets. That also helps the company in terms of life cycle management. You understand your patient population more. If I'm in the business of diabetes, I want to understand the long-term repercussions of patients with diabetes, so I know more solutions I can bring to the market.
I think that sounds great in concept, but realistically, how would that work? And what I mean by that is you'd have to be doing a clinical trial of such a ridiculously large patient population to look at longitudinal studies. How, at a realistic level, how do you propose just observational studies, or what would you think might be a way to achieve that goal?
Observational studies. I think in the age of machine learning, the idea of retrospective studies is over. Okay, because you could do a retrospective study just to get a baseline, but going prospectively, that's what we do. For example, if you look at all like the FDA pre-cert program for all the digital solutions, right, where companies get the pre-certification, the idea is going forward, especially with machine learning, you'll continuously learn about your patient population. It's not a one-time thing, right? So you have a baseline piece where if you look at the predictive value or the probability or likelihood of someone having a disease, initially it could be 50% or 60% in terms of the Apple Watch, for example, right? But if you go over time and you have more information about people, you learn more, the algorithm gets better over time, and you do great. So if you look at Apple Watch, for example, you have tons of data, right? I ran a study once, Ashan, where we had about 160 patients, followed them over 6 months, and we had about 41 years of longitudinal data sets. Those are massive data sets, right? We found out we could predict the risk of people having strokes just by activity and sleep kind of patterns, right? And so these things could happen, and tons of data are being collected every day. Everyone with a Fitbit and Apple Watch, there's massive data sets. So the idea is, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, are they going to evolve to actually incorporate these tech solutions in-house? Or are they going to find partners? Because the future is data-driven, right? It's not this thing of like, oh, vendors hold the data, I'm done with my study, and I have no idea what happens. That's why you hear about big discussions about things like real-world evidence. Right, real evidence, it's exactly what Apple is doing in the real world, like collecting data sets. That means no inclusion, exclusion criteria. How does my drug work in the real world? And that's what payers want to see also. And so it's inevitable that that's the future, right? Because access to payers will be through that real world evidence.
I think you're 100% right. I think the payers definitely want to see that type of data. It definitely helps them to know where to put their money. But I guess let's go back to the point you raised, which is a really interesting point, which is we have so much data. I believe the last time I heard it's something like two exabytes of data every single day or something like that. It's a ridiculous amount of data that's being created. My question is, number one of the big issues with data, as you know, is garbage in, garbage out. And the data is unstructured. Which means that it's, and I know you know this, but I'm really explaining to the audience who may not.
Right.
But it's not like the data is in a column and you can go that number, that number, that number, that number. It's in the middle of notes, which are saying different things in different contexts, and it's hard to understand what all of that means. So my question to you is that tremendous amount of data. Number one, how do you avoid the garbage in, garbage out problem? Number two, if you can avoid that, how do you make sure that the information is actually meaningful? And what I mean by that is, I can't trust my Fitbit, and I'm wearing one right now. I can't trust my Fitbit to give me the number of steps I take every single day. But now I'm suddenly expecting it to tell me if my drug works. And that seems unfair. So what's your thought process around that?
I agree with you about discussing on big data. I'm not a fan of big data. I'm a fan of smart data.
I like that.
Like, what are you measuring as opposed to let's just collect every single thing that you collect? And so the question becomes, it starts with this central point of why. Why are you doing this? Is first question, right? If you're having a Fitbit, what is the goal of you wearing a Fitbit? Is it for activity count? Is it to burn calories? Is it to monitor your oxygen saturation? In that particular case, then you know exactly what you're measuring for your particular outcomes. What is the why? I think that's what everything starts with. The challenge here is a lot of clinicians have no idea what thousands of solutions out there, right? And they don't understand who is doing what and what is the why behind this solution. Why Fitbit and why Apple Watch or why whatever, right? Why not just one? What is each one has a unique thing that is measuring, and you have the same things that could be for heart failure. Different companies working on heart failure, some working for mental health, measuring the exact same things, right? But something is relevant to them, one is not relevant to the other. So that's a big challenge. So if you're doing like a Fitbit kind of thing, you actually have structured data, because you could capture specific things, right? Oxygen saturation, activity. But you know what's interesting, Darshan, is I once worked on a study with the former FDA commissioner, and we discussed the idea of what activity means, right? Do you know activity does not mean the same thing for Fitbit and Apple Watch and everything else? Like activity is different. Yes, completely different. And it's not public. No one knows what activity means, right? A step count for Apple is very different than a step count for Fitbit. And those are all proprietary definitions, right? Intensive activity is also different. So a step count means nothing. It's just the idea, and everyone defines it differently, right? So it's very difficult to do a study where people have different devices, and you are looking at all of them in the same way. They don't define it the same way.
Yeah.
You put a Fitbit on your arm and you put one on Apple Watch and you walk, I bet you have two different readings. Right? So because of that, people don't trust these things because trust them exactly because what does this mean? How do you? And that's a big challenge. And no one has defined that piece right now in healthcare. And so the goal becomes what do you measure and what actually counts becomes a difference.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest challenge in adoption of healthcare solutions. So the first thing I would say is what is your why? And so I'm working with some colleagues to create a platform called Marche Health, like MARCHE Health, where basically what we're doing is bringing all the solutions on board and comparing them side by side. Think about it like a price line for digital health solutions. You start with your why, what you're looking for, and you can literally query and search companies and find the best ones that fit your need. So I think something like that is needed to actually help people feel confident and to adopt the solutions.
I'd take it one step further. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying, but I think you almost need the FDA or a government body or someone coming in and saying, let's define the what. What is activity? Once you know what activity is, then we can start saying we're all working off of the same list. We're eating off the same plate.
Otherwise, not only what is activity, but what is the relevance of that activity? What is the relevance of a 10,000 step count, and how does that relate? What is the clinical benefit of a 10,000 step count?
Well, I would say that if you know what 10,000 steps is, then you can ask the question of why does it matter? But if we don't even agree on what a pound is or what a step is, having 10,000 steps has no meaning. So
correct.
So
and intensive activity is also different than so intensive activity is different than if you had the activity pattern for a long time. It was slow, but we all agree that activity helps improve care. But that correlation is relevant and it matters, right? And that's what we're learning.
That is so interesting. I'd never that is mind blowing to me. That it seems so obvious, but I've never asked that question. So thank you for that. So we're now in a world where we're talking about innovation. We're talking real world evidence. My question for you is, using things like machine learning, using things like artificial intelligence, we're going to potentially get to a place where we might be able to do better than what we've done before. So there's no need for retrospective studies. You start doing prospective studies. Do you think that the way different countries are treating public surveillance and artificial intelligence and data is going to play a huge role on what 2030 looks like? And what I mean by that is Israel came out and they said that the data from COVID, we're happy to give it to whoever wants it. We're the startup nation. China came out and said that we want to use patient data and we're going to use it for public surveillance. But you compare that to something like EMA or technically Europe, and they're coming out and saying we don't want people's individual data to be used against people for through public surveillance. So that becomes a huge issue from a health data perspective. So do you see a future where Israel and China are running miles ahead of what the US and EU are doing?
Oh yes, definitely. I was in the EU and the GDPR stuff. Just using my phone. Yeah. Every time I click on a website, I have to go through reading policies. It became annoying. I just click yes and annoy the thing, right? So it becomes annoying, a piece of like just let go of it.
Yeah.
But I think the issue, if it goes beyond countries, Darshan, I think I make a prediction here that you'll see a company like Amazon selling insurance on an open platform, right? If you look at the strategy in general, I think what's going to divide us and humans will be much bigger than just income itself. We'll be divided across income lines and across healthcare lines. If you look at what happened in COVID, where people with comorbid conditions, those are the highest dying rates, right? Especially among African American communities, people with diabetes and heart disease, but they're dying faster. And those are the ones with the highest mortality rate with COVID. What that tells you is that those are the same people that are more expensive to manage in healthcare in general. What you see a company like Amazon doing by acquiring like a Whole Foods, right? Getting like a pill pack kind of company for generic drugs, getting into activity pieces where they have activity monitoring pieces.
Yeah.
Basically, what you're doing is, and if you look at the Amazon customer base, it's like someone making over $100,000 a year. So you're already in the highest socioeconomic status. The people that are most likely will do yoga, or eat at Whole Foods, exercise, or take care of that stuff. That's a low risk patient population.
Yeah.
Right? So I can literally deliver your groceries for you, healthy groceries for you. I could, if you're sick, I give you generic drugs. And I can literally sell insurance on open market because you're low risk, right? And so Amazon could capture that market piece specifically where your employer, you could say, I don't want to get my employer's insurance. I'll pay on Amazon and let Amazon tell me what I need to do because I'll follow the things on exercise to pay lower premiums. That's what's going to happen. There's no better, like that's a guaranteed piece of where Amazon is going. I make that bold move, that bold prediction. Google is going to get into that. You will see private insurance in the public market. Now, if you look at countries, for example, like in England, for example, or Israel, where you have like a social kind of healthcare kind of program, like, right, that covers everyone. They also want to cut down expenses and cut down risk. So they literally could apply that exact same kind of piece or mindset to say, hey, if you exercise, if you do this, then you have less things. If you go down to Europe, it's hard to find Burger Kings in places, right? I mean, I just walked around. Salads was an option everywhere. Healthy living was more an option. I couldn't find tasty fried chicken in places that I wanted to eat, right? You don't find that. There's more healthy options there because the government is paying for the insurance, so you're going to live healthy, right? There's more exercise places than parks and people go. That's more common in that kind of community. So you will see a lot more of that happening because healthy populations means decreased cost. That's going to be a place where, but I think in the US, corporations will actually split that up. Those low socioeconomic status with poor health will be left out of society. There'll be a big demarcation in society, and that's the scary part.
So interesting. We could keep going, but like I said, we try to aim 15, 20 minutes, and we're almost at double that. So we could just have this conversation over and over and over again. Let me ask you 4 questions. Like I said, I'm going to ask you. The first question, based on what we've discussed, what would you like to ask the audience?
I would like to ask the audience more. We need to create a healthcare movement where we as supporters of digital health kind of solutions, whether you're from legal background or from a tech background or from medical background piece, we need to come together to form our own guidelines and pick the key challenges that we face in adoption of digital health. And I would love for anyone that's interested in that movement to ping you or ping myself, and let's bring the cohort group together, advance this.
Well, sign me up. I'm definitely interested in something like that. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Perfect.
So that's I'm patient number 1 or whatever you want to call it. So there you go. Second question. What is something new you've learned over the last month?
I've learned that different countries treat the management of COVID differently. Right. I was in Madrid, Spain, And on my way back to US, I had to go pay for tests, for COVID tests. And I like 45 euros, I had to pay for it. Then I flew to Amsterdam. When I got to Amsterdam, they were giving out free tests. It's a home test, right? So one country I'm paying, the very next place 3 hours away, it's like, hey, free test for everyone. And everyone has a free test. You test at home. Right. So, the airports in Europe right now look like medical clinics. People in hazard suits, all the clinics there.
Really?
So it's very interesting. Some airports have like digital thermometers, scanners. In Vienna, for example, you come in and scan your temperature. In the US, we don't have that yet. And a lot of people are using touchless credit cards now. I had one before I left, but I never actually used it that much in the US. But in Europe, it's more like, nope, don't touch, just touchless. So there's massive adoption of technology globally. And I love that trend because I think we'll adopt more of these digital solutions going forward.
Oh, very cool. What is something that made you happy in the last week?
Last week, what makes me happy? I went to a concert in Madrid, and it was great to sit outside in the garden and just watch people listen to music and people being happy to be out and meeting each other again. I think it was fantastic. It's great to meet each other in person again.
That's awesome. And the last question: how can people find you?
People can connect with me at Manny, MANNY, at marche.health, or send me a message on my LinkedIn.
Let me put that into a banner. Manny at Marche Health, Marche.health. Hold on. Is this what you had in mind?
Perfect. Yep, that's it.
Excellent. And
the A instead of the E.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me change that out. MARCHE, you said?
Yeah, MAR. Marche is like market in French. Perfect. Yep.
Okay, there we go. And just to do a quick recap, Manny, we landed up talking a little bit about change. We talked about what innovation looked like. We talked a little bit about telemedicine. We asked questions about, should we aim for the lowest common denominator? What do you compare as the future of 2030? And we sort of talked a little bit about what 2030 in New York would look like versus in Cameroon, and how those could be very different. We talked a little bit about Marvel and Star Trek and what that and their futuristic look, if you will. We talked a little bit about owning data. We talked about tech care versus sick care. Sorry, sick care versus healthcare. Healthcare. Thank you. And I thought that was fascinating. And then we got into real-world evidence and what the implications of that are. And we talked about artificial intelligence in that context. And then you used the word smart data, which I haven't, maybe it's been used, but it hasn't hit me the same way. But I just thought it was an interesting discussion we had. My biggest takeaway from our conversation is this idea of there's no centralized definition of activity. So the number of steps you take may or may not register if they don't qualify for that activity, and each company defines that differently, which I think is mind-blowing. And we very briefly touched on this, but I think I'd love to have you back and we can talk a little bit about the social determinants of health in the context of universal basic income and what that would mean. So
I look forward to that. That'd be fun.
It'd be a really good conversation. And again, Manny, thank you so much for coming on. This is going to be great. I can't wait to have you back on again.
Same here. Thanks, Dasha. Take care.